Hello everyone and welcome back to my Warhammer 40k guides. I am Brady and today I will be bringing you part 1 of the long-awaited Chaos Space Marine faction focus. These videos will be a guide on ways you can play Chaos Space Marines efficiently, including the strengths and weaknesses of the army, the different types of lists you can make with the army, the stratagems and spells that are strong and complement the army, the warlord traits and legion traits that are optimal, the relics that are strong, and the units that I think are good or optimal for competitive play. Like I mentioned previously, this video is going to be part 1 of 2, and in this video, I will cover the strengths and weaknesses, the types of builds you can use, and the stratagems and psychic spells. And in part 2, I will talk about the legion traits, warlord traits, relics, and the actual units in the army. I really wanted to put all this information into one video, but as I am writing the script, I can see that that's not going to be possible without making an hour-plus long video. So I am choosing to divide it up into 2 parts to save your time and my time. And the last thing I would like to mention before we get into the actual topics of this video, I would recommend checking out my video, How to Build a Competitive Army, to familiarize yourself with the terms that I use in that video, since they will be frequent throughout this one. It also gives a better idea of how to actually build a list and utilize the information I'm going to give you in this video. So if you're new to the game and haven't watched that video yet, I recommend you do so and then come back to this video. So with that said, let's not waste any more time and let's just jump right into the main content of this video. Strengths and weaknesses. So for strengths, Chaos Space Marines have some of the best close combat units in the game, especially against Imperium armies, since they have rules like Death to the False Emperor that give them extra attacks on hit rolls of 6 against Imperium units. And they also have stratagems that allow them to buff their attacks or even attack more than once, which is pretty good against pretty much every army. They also have some really amazing stratagems that can create some insane combos. In fact, the army can be very combo heavy if you would like it to be. Chaos Space Marines can also be played many different ways with many different playstyles. They are probably one of the more versatile armies in the game in that regard. Not all of these playstyles or builds are competitive worthy in my opinion, but at least the options are still there. They also have access to one of the best screening units in the game, which is the Chaos Cultists. They can be used to great effect depending on your build. And also, because they are from the Chaos faction, they have a ton of options for allies to help complement them and cover Chaos Space Marines' weaknesses, like Thousand Suns, Chaos Knights, Chaos Guard, also known as Renegades, Death Guard, and even Chaos Demons. As for their weaknesses, their shooting builds or gunline builds are okay, but easily get out-gunlined by other armies that do it better. They also don't have the best psychic phase, or sometimes even no psychic phase at all if you choose to play World Eaters. They are also kind of slow when it comes to movement when compared to some armies, and can be kited very easily by some of the faster armies like Drukhari. They also lack good deep striking melee options since they don't have anything to give them a 3d6 charge like some other factions in the game like Blood Angels, which makes a lot of their deep striking units suboptimal in my opinion, like Terminators and Warp Talons. And it forces the army to either be played as a melee rush army or a death ball army if you want any melee in your list. Chaos Space Marines also don't have any command point regeneration like some other armies do. So the command points you start with at the beginning of the game is all you're going to get for that game. When it comes to these weaknesses though, you can easily cover them with allies like I mentioned when talking about the army strengths. For some sort of command point regeneration, you can ally in Thousand Suns. They have a relic called the Helm of Spite, which gains command points on the roll of a 5-up when your opponent uses a stratagem. For better Psychic, you can ally in some more Thousand Suns. And for better deep striking melee, you can ally in some Bloodletters from the Chaos Demons that get a 3d6 charge out of Deep Strike. That's the beauty of list building in 8th edition. You can always cover your main army's weaknesses with allies unless you're playing Necrons or Tau. Now let's talk about the different types of armies you can make with Chaos Space Marines. You can make a Horde army with a lot of cultists. You can make a Deathball army with cultists plus a ton of strong characters to follow up behind them. You can make a melee rush army with stuff like Berserkers and Rhinos getting in your opponent's face. Or you can make a gunline with cultists, Hellbrutes, Havocs, and Obliterators. As for which type of build is best in my opinion, I think the Horde Deathball army with a tiny bit of gun support is the best way to go, because Abaddon is amazing in Horde armies and he makes a good beatstick. And you can have so many bodies on the field that it's almost impossible for most armies in the game to reliably deal with it, and it gives you a tremendous amount of board control. Also, because Chaos Space Marines has some really good units that fit into this playstyle very well, which I will talk about later when I get into the units in the next episode. With that said, I think you can still do well with any of the types of builds I mentioned above, but I think Horde and Deathball armies are the most optimal way to play the list. This is because I think it is incredibly hard to play a melee rush army properly, because it requires a very good understanding of the charge and fight phase, and how to abuse pile-ins and consolidations, and also how to keep your melee units alive in the following turn by surrounding an enemy model, which is a lot harder than it sounds. And if you're up against a good opponent, they will know how to avoid these things with stuff like screening units and area denial. And as for gun lines, well, I already mentioned it, but Chaos Space Marine gun lines get out-gun-lined by other armies that do it much better, like Imperial Guard or Ultramarines. That doesn't mean you can't make those other playstyles or builds work, it's just harder to do so in my opinion, which makes it less reliable and effective to win games. So with that out of the way, let's get into the stratagems and spells the army has access to, and how they will affect your army and playstyle. I will go over the stratagems that I think are the most useful and powerful, then I will quickly explain why I think the remaining stratagems that I didn't cover are too situational or not that good. So let's start with my favorite stratagem, and in my opinion, the best stratagem or second best stratagem in the Codex, and that is Veterans of the Long War. For one command point, Veterans of the Long War can be activated on any Heretic Astartes infantry unit in the Codex. And what it does is it gives +1 to your wound rolls for the rest of the phase when it's activated. This can be done in the shooting phase or even in the fight phase to help your infantry wound the enemy much more efficiently. You can make units like Havocs with last cannons wound most tanks in the game on 2+. And you can make units like Berserkers wound most infantry in the game on 2+. And again, this stratagem lasts for the whole phase, which allows for some shenanigans and combos with other stratagems and abilities, which is a perfect segue into the next two stratagems I will discuss. Fury of Khorne. For 3 command points, this stratagem allows a Khorne infantry unit to attack again at the end of the phase. So when combined with Veterans of the Long War, the Veterans effect remains for the second set of attacks as well as the first set of attacks if you activated it for the first set of attacks, because it lasts for the entire phase. Meaning you can have +1 to wound and get to attack twice using this combo with these two stratagems. This is great on characters like Abaddon or Khorne the Betrayer, or even a blob of World Eater cultists, or a unit of Khorne Berserkers. Sure, this stratagem is a little pricey, but it can be the difference between getting stuck in combat with something that can kill you next turn, or killing that unit outright this turn. Endless Cacophony. For 2 command points, this stratagem is the same as Fury of Khorne, except it's for Slaanesh infantry and for shooting attacks. You can make a Slaanesh infantry unit fire for a second time at the end of your shooting phase, which again, like Fury of Khorne, can be combined with Veterans of the Long War to affect both volleys of shot, giving you +1 to wound both times while you're having to spend 1 command point for Veterans and 2 command points for Endless Cacophony. This is great on units like Havocs, Obliterators, and blobs of 40 cultists. The Great Sorcerer. For 1 command point, you can make a Tzeentch Psyker cast an extra spell. This can come in clutch when you need to use all of your spells in that turn. It can also be very deceitful to your opponent, because if you're playing against an opponent who doesn't know this stratagem exists, they might waste their deny rolls on spells you normally cast and might not have another deny roll for the spell you might use after using this stratagem. So keep that in mind when trying to bait out denial rolls from your opponent. Tide of Traitors. For 2 command points, this stratagem allows you to pick up a unit of cultists and replace all of the dead models in that unit to bring the unit back up to full strength. It then also allows you to deep strike that unit within 6 inches of any table edge, but also 9 inches away from enemy models. This is a great stratagem if you're using a blob or 2 of Chaos Cultists. The stratagem was FAQ'd to only work once per game, but even still, it's a great stratagem that can basically negate the damage your opponent did on turn 1 if they were dumb enough to shoot at the Chaos Cultist squad and they didn't manage to kill the whole thing. You can also use the generic stratagem Insane Bravery to keep the squad of cultists alive from a morale check if needed. So then you can use Tide of Traitors on the following turn. You can also use this stratagem on the cultist blob if it is stuck in combat to remove them from combat, reimburse them with more models, and then they can still shoot and charge as normal because they technically didn't fall back. You can also use this stratagem to get into your opponent's backline and cause a death sandwich, so to speak, and to hit the enemy from both sides, causing them to have to split up their army to deal with the war on 2 fronts. This stratagem has a lot of versatility and ways it can be used, which makes it one of the best stratagems in the book in my opinion. Daemonforge. For 1 command point, you can use this stratagem on a keyword demon vehicle unit, and it allows that unit to reroll all failed hits and wounds, basically giving that unit a Guilliman buff. I was hesitant to include this stratagem in the good stratagems because most demon vehicles in the Codex aren't optimal for competitive play, at least right now, because they are too expensive for what they do in my opinion. Also because Games Workshop has been making tons of changes, who knows what changes are in store for the future. Maybe all of our demon vehicles get lower prices in the future, which will make Daemonforge an actual good option. So that's mainly why I decided to include the stratagem in this part. Fire Frenzy. For 1 command point, this stratagem allows one of your Hellbrutes to fire all of its weapons twice at the nearest enemy unit. This is good if you bring Daka Brutes, who use ranged weapons of your choice. The most optimal loadout, in my opinion, would be a twin heavy bolter and a missile launcher. This is because more often than not, your opponent's screening units will be the closest unit, meaning for 1 command point in a 114 point model, you can have 12 heavy bolter shots and 2d6 frag missile shots, most likely re-rolling 1s for all failed hits depending on if you brought a support character to buff the Hellbrute alongside other units. This is an insane value and a great stratagem when used on the proper loadout. It can also work with a twin last cannon and missile launcher Hellbrute, but more often than not won't be as efficient as the previous loadout because usually your opponent's tanks and big targets will be behind the screening units, meaning the screening units are going to be the closest unit, meaning you'll get the fire twice at that unit. The only situation where I feel the second loadout is better is against Knights or Demon Primarchs, because those units tend to get in your face really quickly and don't really stay behind their screen very long, meaning they will be the closest target. Keep in mind though, this stratagem works on the Hellbrute model only, and not the Hellbrute keyword, meaning you cannot use this stratagem on Forge World Dreadnoughts like Contemptors or Daradeos. This was FAQ'd a while ago. Forward Operatives. For 1 command point, you can infiltrate an Alpha Legion infantry unit before the game begins. This happens after the roll to see who goes first, and after the seize the initiative roll, so you know who's going to have the first turn before you actually deploy your unit or units, since this stratagem can be used multiple times because it's a pre-game stratagem. This is important because it will determine how you set up your infiltrating unit or units. If you're going to go first, then go all out and put them in the opponent's face for maximum damage and a possible charge. And if you're going second, then you can play a bit more defensively and hide them in the middle of the board behind line of sight blocking terrain, or even back in your own deployment. Going second with this stratagem makes it feel like a waste of command points, but it's a low risk, high reward stratagem in my opinion. If you go first, you can pull off a pretty decent alpha strike that could net you an advantage that puts you well into the lead. And if you go second, you can lose 1 command point for each unit that you used it on, but then you deploy normally, so it's not that big of a deal. Units that are great for this are Khorne Berserkers or a 40-man cultist blob, assuming you're going to go first. If used on the Khorne Berserkers, you can deploy the Khorne Berserkers 9 inches away from the enemy models before the game begins, then on your first turn, move them up 6 inches for a 3-inch charge against the enemy screen, which the Berserkers are amazing at killing. And depending on the way your opponent deployed, you have the potential to kill 2 enemy screening units with your first 2 set of attacks, because Khorne Berserkers can attack twice, and then use the Fury of Khorne stratagem for a 3rd set of attacks, meaning you could possibly kill your opponent's entire screen, or at least a good chunk of it on turn 1. And then you have the possibility of tying up a shooting unit when you are finished, or surrounding a model to keep your Berserkers safe from shooting the next turn. Also, remember that you can combine this with the use of Veterans of the Long War to make them super efficient, since it stays the same for the entire fight phase, which means all 2 or 3 sets of attacks will have +1 to wound. With Cultists, you can do the same thing. You can either go the Khorne route with close combat versions of Cultists, but this isn't as efficient as the Berserkers in my opinion. Or you can go the Slaanesh route with autoguns, use Veterans in the shooting phase to shoot the units behind the screen, and then use Endless Cacophony to shoot again with Veterans. And in the charge phase, you can charge and use Veterans again for some decent damage, or even just surrounding the enemy unit to keep your unit from being shot at again. Overall, I think this stratagem is amazing, and can pretty much straight up win you the game on turn 1 if done properly, and if your opponent didn't deploy properly to minimize the potential of your alpha strike. Scorn of Sorcery. For 1 command point, you can have a World Eaters unit deny a psychic spell on a roll of a 4+. This is pretty good in my opinion, and it's the best psychic defense Chaos Space Marines have to offer. Sure, it's on the roll of a 4+, but you also have a command reroll to try again if that roll fails, meaning this stratagem has a decent chance of denying that spell. And some spells in the game are strong enough to really dictate who is going to pull ahead, so being able to somewhat easily deny that spell can come in clutch. The one downside to this stratagem is you can only use it once per phase, like every other stratagem in the game. So save it for that one spell your opponent is going to use that will hurt you the most. And last but not least, we have the Demon Shell stratagem. For 1 command point, this stratagem allows a Heretic Astartes character to make a single shot with a bolt pistol, bolt gun, combi bolter, or the bolt gun profile of a combi weapon. And if they hit, will do an automatic D3 mortal wounds instead of normal damage. If they happen to miss though, they suffer D3 mortal wounds themselves, and the misses are not allowed to be rerolled. Most of the characters in the book that come with these weapons that can use this stratagem though have a ballistic skill of 2+, meaning the shot will only fail on a 1. I think this works well with bolt guns because of the 24-inch range, so it's almost like a targeted smite that goes off on the roll of a 2+. And if you're using a pistol, it's still like a targeted smite but goes off on a 2+, but it's also a great way to shoot while in combat and annihilate a target with a good invulnerable save that charged your character but failed in killing them. And then you can smack them back again in combat afterwards. The second example is much more situational than the first, but it's still something that has come up in my own game, so I mention it. And that covers it for all the stratagems, which I think are really strong and work well with good builds. As for the rest of the stratagems, I feel they are suboptimal because they either offer something that I don't feel is good enough, or what they do offer can be offered by something else like an ability from a unit. If you compare the stratagems I didn't mention to the ones that I did mention, you can easily see that the stratagems mentioned offer so much more than the other ones. And the other ones either require you to take multiple units you might not want, or just don't offer as much as the other stratagems in terms of damage or options. Now we have one more thing to discuss in this video, and that is the psychic spells the army has to offer. Chaos Space Marines have the Dark Hereticus discipline, which consists of 9 spells, including the 3 you get from being certain marks of chaos. The first spell I'm going to discuss is Infernal Gaze. It's a warp charge value of 5, which is really easy to get off, and it's basically like a second smite, except you can pick your target, and it doesn't have to be the closest enemy unit. It still has an 18-inch range, but instead of doing D3 mortal wounds like Smite, you roll 3 dice, and for every 4+ you get, it does a mortal wound. So you can get 0 to 3 mortal wounds from this spell for almost the same effect as Smite. More often than not though, you'll get at least 1 or 2 mortal wounds to go through. This spell is great if you want to assassinate a character who will be protected all game, like a company commander, or if you're going against an elite army that has a ton of good invulnerable saves, like Space Wolf Cavalry or Custodes. Other than that though, I think there are other spells that accomplish more than this one, but this spell does have its own little niche for when it can be good. The next spell is Death Hex, and this spell is amazing. It's Warp Charge 8 and only a 12-inch range, but you can target an enemy unit and cancel its invulnerable saves until the next psychic phase. This is huge against most armies in the game. You can take away the 3+ invul Storm Shields give, you can cancel the 4+ invul from Custodes, you can cancel the 5+ or 4+ or 3+ invul of a Knight if your opponent upgraded it that way. It can cancel any enemy invulnerable save in the game. This spell can win you the game if used properly and if it actually goes off. The downside to this spell is its high warp charge value, and also the fact that Chaos Space Marines have no psychers that get +1 or any buffs to casting spells, meaning you have to roll a natural 8 on 2 dice, which isn't the hardest thing to do in the world, but it's still somewhat of a gamble. So overall, this spell is really good if you can get it off. In fact, it's one of the better spells in the game in my opinion, but it's about a 50-50 chance when it comes to casting, and then your opponent still gets to deny if they're in range. Meaning against a model like Magnus, you will most likely never get this to work unless you're really lucky. And you had to get close to use it, meaning you just put yourself in a vulnerable position. To be honest, this spell is better used in Thousand Suns, since they have ways to get a +1 or a +2, or even a +3 to their spells, and because Thousand Suns get an extra 6-inch range on their spells, it makes Death Hex 18 inches in that regard. But this is the Chaos Space Marine faction focus, and not the Thousand Suns faction focus, so that will be discussed on another day in another video. Gifts of Chaos is the next spell. It has a warp charge value of 6 and a range of 6 inches. So it's easy to cast, but doesn't have a great range. What the spell does is you pick an enemy unit within 6 inches and roll a d6. If the d6 is higher than the unit's toughness, that unit suffers 3 plus d3 mortal wounds for 4 to 6 mortal wounds altogether. This is great against toughness 3 units like guardsmen or cultists, and okay against units with toughness 4 since you only have a 33% chance to wound. But it still might be worth taking depending on the situation in the army you're up against. So normally I would only take this if I plan on having my Psyker in the enemy's lines, duking it out, and if the enemy has an abundance of T3 models to cast it on. There is also a bonus that if you kill a character with this spell, you turn them into a Chaos Spawn. but that's only for narrative play, because in competitive play you would have to pay the points for that spawn in your list, which you probably don't have room for in your list. And if you made room for it, then you're wasting points, because that spell might not ever go off, and even if it does, the chances of it killing a character are slim to none, because your opponent can just keep their characters out of the 6-inch range. The next spell is Prescience, which is one of my favorite spells to use. It has a warp charge value of 7 and gives a +1 to hit to a friendly Heretic Astartes unit within 18 inches until your next psychic phase. This means that unit will have a +1 to hit when shooting and when in close combat. I normally only make use out of one or the other, but there are times when you can make use of both. It also complements some of the stratagems I talked about earlier really well. For example, you can Prescience a unit of Havoc Marines to give them +1 to hit, and then activate Veterans on them to give them +1 to wound, and then use Endless Cacophony to shoot again with the same buffs. It's actually a really great combo in my opinion. You can also use it to negate -1 to hit modifiers your opponent may have, which keeps your units as efficient as possible when targeting those units. Then you have the spell Diabolic Strength, which is a warp charge value of 6 and has a 12-inch range. You can target a friendly model within range and give them +2 strength and 1 attack. So for warp charge 6, this is pretty good since it will go off more often than not, and with a 12-inch range you can almost always target a friendly unit if you're playing a Deathball style army. This is great to activate on units like Demon Princes, Chaos Lords, or even Abaddon. And then we have the last generic spell from the Hereticus discipline, which is Warp Time. Warp Time is a warp charge value of 6 and has a 3-inch range, so it's fairly easy to get off but does suffer from an insanely short range. You can target a friendly Heretic Astartes unit and allow that unit to move as if it were the movement phase. This is great for units like Demon Princes or Mauler Fiends because it helps them get into the enemy's face much quicker, and then they can even still charge afterwards. Or you can use it on a unit of Berserkers, or really any unit that wants to get close and start stabbing people. It also helps with board control and allows you to grab objectives that you might not have been able to reach otherwise. An example of this is if you have a unit of Cultists advancing up the board with your Sorcerer, but you're about 7 inches away from an objective, you can Warp Time the Cultists to move them up to get within the range of the objective. There are a few uses for this spell, but those are the most prevalent ones from what I've seen. Now let's talk about the final 3 spells that the Psyker can unlock access to by being a certain Mark of Chaos. We have Delightful Agonies. This spell is unlocked by a Mark of Slaanesh Psyker. It has the warp charge value of 6 and an 18-inch range. You can target a friendly Heretic Astartes Slaanesh unit and give that unit a 5+ Feel No Pain, which is pretty damn good. Throw this on a blob of cultists to give them more survivability, or a multi-wound model like a Land Raider to make it even more durable than it already is. A cool way that I like to use this stratagem is by infiltrating this guy alongside my blob of cultists in an Alpha Legion army, and if you go first, you can cast this and Prescience on your cultist blob to make them way more efficient and survivable while they're in the enemy's lines duking it out. The Tzeentch spell is Weaver of Fates, and it's a warp charge 6 with an 18-inch range. And although Thousand Suns have their own version of this spell, which can only be used on Thousand Suns units, the Chaos Space Marine version of this spell can go on any Tzeentch Heretic Astartes unit, and it increases the unit's invulnerable saves by 1. Or gives them a 5+ invulnerable save if they didn't have an invulnerable save in the first place. Please note though that if you have Thousand Suns allies, these spells do not stack. In fact, you can only use one or the other each turn because they still share the same name, meaning with rules as written, it's technically the same spell, so you can only cast it once per phase. With that said, this is great on your characters since the majority of them come with invulnerable saves. So you can make a Demon Prince have a 4+ invul instead of a 5+, or a Chaos Lord have a 3+ invul instead of a 4+. It makes your units much more durable in order to survive high AP attacks. And last but not least, we have the Nurgle spell, which is Miasma of Pestilence. Like Weaver of Fates, Miasma of Pestilence has 2 versions, the Death Guard version and the Chaos Space Marine version. And again, these spells don't stack if you try to use both of them, because again, they are both technically the same spell and can only be used once per turn. The Chaos Space Marine version is a warp charge 6 with a range of 18 like the other 2 Chaos Mark spells, but this spell makes a Nurgle Heretic Astartes unit -1 to hit. This is great against gun lines, but also works in close combat too. So if you have a unit that might get shot at next turn because it's the biggest target, or it might take damage when running into a charge, you can try to negate some of that damage that will actually be making it through to your unit to make it a bit more resilient. So as you can see, each of these Chaos Mark spells only work on units that have the same mark as the spell. So you can't really stack all of these spells onto one unit unless they have all 3 of those marks. And the majority of the units in the game only come with one Mark of Chaos keyword, so they can only have one mark. But if there was a unit that had all 4 Chaos marks and can benefit from all these spells, plus the attack twice stratagem for Khorne, if only that unit existed, then I would probably talk about it in great lengths in part 2 of this video when I discuss the units Chaos Space Marines have to offer. Well anyways, that about covers all the topics for this video today. And as you guys have noticed, this was an exceptionally longer video than most of my videos, which is why I chose to break it up into 2 parts. Hopefully you guys don't mind that, and hopefully you guys are looking forward to part 2. I think all of the faction focuses I make in the future will be 2-parters, but we will have to see when that time comes. I would also prefer to have all of the information in one video for your convenience, but for the sake of my time and yours, I would rather just make 2 parts and make it less strenuous on myself. These types of videos take a lot longer than some people might expect, and it's very taxing on me, so please bear with it if it does take me a while to make these videos and for them to come out. With that said though, the script for part 2 is already finished, and I just need to record it and edit it, and it should be out within the same week as this video. If not, it's because either life got in the way or I had other videos I wanted to get to first. So like I said, that about covers everything for this video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more Warhammer 40k content, and also check me out on Patreon. I offer a list building service and a Discord channel for all my patrons. I help my patrons every day with their lists and give lots of advice on the game of 40k. And it's a lot of great fun, and we have a constantly growing community of other patrons who enjoy playing and talking about 40k just as much as you do. So if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, then check me out on Patreon. It's only a $5 subscription to gain all of these benefits, so come check it out. Patreon allows me to continue making videos full time and allows me to invest as much time and effort as I can into making these videos. So if you want to help out and keep the channel going, then feel free to check it out and possibly donate. The link will be in the description. Also, don't forget to check out the channel sponsor, themagnetbaron.com. They offer magnets of all sizes, magnetized movement trays, magnetized flight stands, and even offer fully built and magnetized models, all for a great price. So if you're looking at picking up anything magnet related for the hobby, then check out themagnetbaron.com. The link will be in the description. Well anyways, thanks for watching the video, and I hope I was able to help you learn about Chaos Space Marines and how to play them. And I hope you're looking forward to part 2. With that said, thanks again for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Happy wargaming.